Well, hello, everybody. I'm Hugh Seaton. Thank you for joining me for the Construction Technology Quarterly. This is actually the fourth time we've done this, the first time being Q4 of last year. A couple of questions that came through in the chat. As you could just hear, I'm recording this. I will post it onto YouTube usually the next day. And the slides, which today is going to be particularly helpful, I also put up on SlideShare. You can find the link for the slides in the YouTube, excuse me. So if there's, and it's as PDF, so you can always pull stuff, which I encourage. A lot of the point of doing this is to go find stuff, do a little analysis, and then make it available for people to reuse as you see fit. We're all trying to move this industry forward, and this is my little contribution. So again, thank you guys for joining today. I always go with demand, supply, and then some ideas. I read a little more than is strictly healthy, so I think some of these ideas that I come across might be of value, both for evaluating startups, evaluating people that are coming to try to share their technology with you, and if you're trying to build something yourself. So in the past year, I've gone through primarily BLS data about the construction industry. Looking at different firm sizes, looking at different, a bunch of different angles. So today I went kind of deep. So, strap in. I'll get through it with some conclusions and some reasons why you should care. We'll talk a little bit about real estate. I think that one of the areas I'd like to explore, certainly in Q4, is how do we intersect with real estate, and how does that affect the market that we care about? So there's only a couple of slides this time to start getting some sizing, and we'll explore that more later. But at the end of the day, you can often understand someone's behavior by who's paying them. And then in supply, this is usually where I talk about technology. There's a lot of talk about data warehouses, products, so on and so forth. So I'm going to just describe what some of that is and why you should care. Some folks on the call are going to know some of this, but these are words that are getting used increasingly, and I'm hearing them used by the IT teams at General Contractors. McCarthy had a fantastic presentation at the Advancing AEC conference a little while ago that just blew me away with how sophisticated they were. So I thought it's a good idea for the broader community to start thinking about what these things mean. And as I said before, on the ideas, value chain and value curve analysis are simple ways to think about competition and how to build a better product and better company. So I call this first part demand. This is the idea of who's the market we're selling to, supporting, or working in the middle of. It's massive, which everybody knows, but it's also complex, as we're going to see today. And I want to put some, as I said a minute ago, I want to start to put some numbers around some of this. It's way too much for anyone to summarize or memorize, but I think you can start to get a sense for the pockets of activity and a little bit of the topography of the industry. So I've said a couple of times now that nobody really plays in a 1.3 trillion market. Everybody likes to put that at the beginning of their pitch deck, but you're just not selling to that broad a market. So a lot of what we've spoken about, and these are some screenshots here on the right, are trying to get at, okay, well, what really is there? So today I want to take that a step deeper and just kind of draw a line under it until the government releases the next 5-yearly census, which is the economic census is once every 5 years. And we're a little overdue, but who knows, they've been busy. So I think that'll be enough to get a sense of the complexity and a sense of what's in the market. So one thing I'll say along the way is I like to stop when I can to answer questions. So just pop something in the chat. I'll do my best to react to that. And if not, of course, we have a Q&A at the end. Right, so a note on BLS data before I go any further. A lot of this data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and or the census. At this level of scale, it's usually the best we have without spending exorbitant amounts of money. There are some amazing data sources out there that charge an arm and a leg for what they do. So, and the point here is context, orienting your own analysis and giving people on the call just another set of data points. And other than this, you're not going to have any idea about the relative size of industrial versus commercial construction, which you're about to have a sense of, or how much they make per worker and so on and so forth. So what we've tried to do is give you a first start so that later on when people come to you and say, we've got a great product for EPC, you have a sense of how big that market is and some idea of what's going on there. The way the census chooses to break things out, it's not arbitrary, but it has to be durable, which means it doesn't always reflect the way we currently see the world. Honestly, I think they've done a reasonable job, but it sort of is what it is. So we expect, as I say, updates in the next year or so. So I'd ask the folks on the call not to mark whatever that is. I think the guy's name is Victor. If you could not do that, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll have to ask you to leave. The next piece here and what's going to organize this is NAICS is what, I'm sorry to get into this stuff, but BLS organizes their data according to the kind of the NAICS hierarchy. So the industry is kind of the highest level, and under that it goes down to 6 digits, and you'll see us do a little bit of that. This gives you an idea of kind of the structure that I'm going to use for us to understand the industry. So sorry, this is an eye chart. Everybody grab some coffee. We'll walk through these. What I'm able to work with here is actually a $1.9 trillion baseline because they have to double contract subcontractors, a double count, excuse me. I don't love that, but it's sort of the data we have. So you look at 3 pieces that are right under construction. So the general way we look at construction, it's then broken down into buildings of varying types, and we'll get into what those are in a minute. Heavy civil, and then specialty contractors. That's why I say they sort of recounted there or double counted there. So the first thing that you look at here is building has about 200 plus thousand companies. That's interesting across the 700,000 that we had looked at before, where not surprisingly, most of them are specialty subcontractors. Interesting how small heavy civil is. I mean, needless to say, heavy civil is by definition, these are big companies that have big machines and do big things. Building, again, of that is about 800 million. So in the past, we've seen this broken in half with 400 and 400, and you're going to see that. So all this is about to get broken down even further. This is just level 2. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do is start to get a sense of how the economics works. And you start to see a little bit that you know, right here it's workers and then revenue per worker. So this is the number of workers per company, which is interesting. And then revenue per worker, this is in thousands. So the highest of them by a lot is the revenue per worker for general contractors, you should assume, is the highest of the 3. And then in terms of the number of people per, it's the highest in heavy civil, which is really interesting. Keep in mind, unfortunately, some of these numbers are pulled across a really big base. So they're indicative, but they give you an idea of what's going on. Now, another one that's interesting is revenue per firm, which can be thought of as and of course, these are thousands, so that's 3 million. So this can be thought of as a proxy of how big the companies are. Right. So not surprisingly, heavy civil doesn't play around. If you're going to be, you know, making a highway, you can't have 3 guys and a shovel. Whereas that you could do that potentially, I don't know about for a general contractor, but you can have smaller companies, whereas you just simply can't. What's interesting is how specialty contractors, the average size, well, anyway, the average revenue per company is actually only about 2/3 to a half of what general contractors are. Really, really kind of interesting that size works out like that. So what does this mean? And so I'm going to try to pull out lessons. The reality is this information is now going to be available for you to play around with. The first one is there's a lot of subcontractors. General contractors represent more revenue as companies and per worker. As I said, there is a little bit of double counting because general contractors turn around and pay subcontractors. There's really no way around that without a lot of invasive questions, which they don't get to do. So you're kind of comparing them knowing that that's true. Heavy civil is a smaller market, but big firms doing high dollar volume, as I said. Again, kind of obvious. I just thought the degree is interesting that heavy civil is 3 times the size of you know, potentially commercial and industrial. So that's kind of one swipe. What I want to now just make sure you guys are clear on how this works. So this was one big look. Now we're going to go into building, we're going to go into heavy civil and specialty contractors. The point being that depending on what you're doing or who you're talking to, different parts of this will be more interesting than others. Heavy civil is a little bit lightweight, no pun intended, just because it's a bit narrower of a market. So of the building types that they break out are residential and non-residential. Now, we're not going to go quite this deep again, but for building types, we're going to go again into what parts of residential and what parts of non-residential. So there's another layer of analysis below this. But first, let's look at this. Not surprisingly, residential and non-residential are pretty close to each other. I've actually shared another version of this and I think the first one last year, the first presentation. What's interesting also, again, is the number of firms. How many more residential? And you're going to see, of course, that covers a lot of really small companies. So we break that down even further. And then, this is a little bit, to me, interesting, is you're talking about a really big delta between residential and non-residential in terms of revenue per firm. Obviously, this is a mirror image almost of the number of firms. So it's not surprising if you think about this as the denominator and this is the numerator. Surprise, surprise. Nevertheless, I think that delta is kind of interesting. And then the revenue spelled in it, I'm all about creativity here, per worker is interesting as well. So residential building is meaningfully lower per worker than non-residential. So again, so you're going to see a pattern here is I don't want to spend too much time in eye charts. We'll talk about what it means. So almost the same market size as I noted, residential firms have about 1/5 the revenue per firm as non-residential. Keep in mind, there's a lot of not very big non-residential projects out there. So I think that's interesting that the delta is that big. There's a lot of small houses too, but there's a lot of retail. There's a lot of other things that are non-residential. So again, that 1/5 or 20% is really interesting. Residential firms earn about 70% of what per worker of what non-residential do. That's again kind of interesting. It's not so much surprising as it's good to have a sense of the scale of what you might have already intuitively understood. So again, intuition says that residential is a hard market for companies to address. This starts to support that, and in a moment you'll see data that does that even further. So now we're looking at residential building subtypes. So to be honest, this isn't that hard to dig out of the census, except I found it really off-putting. So again, now you have it. If you ever want to see this stuff again, this is slightly older data from 2017. It's the only data we have. So this is more for scale than it is to look at the specific numbers. You look at residential revenue, and here again, this is interesting. So in new single family, this is, I go to somebody and say, build me a house. That's 68 billion. Okay, that's not nothing. New multifamily housing, same kind of idea. What's interesting here is new housing for sale. So these are companies that are making, subdivisions and so on, meaningfully bigger, like lots bigger, double at least. Residential building types, how many workers? For each of these four, what have we got? So for new single family, it's a pretty big, it's the biggest, well, second biggest number. We'll get into what these folks do in a sec. Interesting that new homes for sale is as large as it is also. So then when you look at revenue per worker, people that are investing to create new, to create new homes pay the best. Now the delta is not massive, but again, you're covering an awful lot of people. What's interesting is whatever residential modelers is, there's a ton of them. They don't make any money, either individually or as firms. So this is one of those times where aggregating data can sometimes really throw off what picture you see. Because you can imagine if you pulled this out, how different the averages up here would start to look when you talk about the whole residential building. So what does this tell us? Residential is much more complicated than some of these top line numbers. Companies that build for sale are the largest, which I mentioned. Companies that build for multifamily are actually the largest companies, which I didn't call out. But if you look at the revenue per company, the largest are people that are making multifamily housing. Residential remodels, as I said, they warp the picture. There's a ton of them and they don't make any money. An ongoing issue really in construction is how many single proprietors there are in smaller companies that may or may not make a lot of money, but they're there and they're counted. So the next piece that is often of more interest, in fact, Darren asked this question in the first one, is can we break out non-residential building construction? And yes, we can. So the way they break it out is industrial and then commercial and institutional. So industrial is loosely EPC. Not everything EPC does. This is some of it, especially if you think about if Johnson & Johnson makes a chemical factory, it's likely to be this. This is not likely to be oil and gas. That's covered somewhere else. Commercial and institutional building construction is what you think it is. It's college campuses and bank buildings. So this delta, again, I find surprising. I mean, I'm sitting in the middle of New York City, which is a bit of an illustration of why this delta is true. There's an awful lot of office buildings and not as many chemical factories. The number of firms is loosely the same kind of ratio. Interesting that commercial and institutional this implies that they're bigger companies and meaningfully larger, about a quarter larger, a quarter to a fifth larger. That's interesting to me because you would think that these are bigger projects, so they require bigger folks, but that obviously isn't always true. And then same thing, revenue per worker, meaningfully larger when you're looking at commercial versus industrial. I don't have a huge idea why that is, except that they do self-perform, which I think I call out here. So industrial is about 6% of the market size of commercial. Interesting. Again, this roughly corresponds to EPC market, although again, it's not drawn that way. So we do our best to make these correspondences. Industrial construction firms are smaller. I called that out. The fact that industrial construction earns half the revenue per worker that commercial does, as I say, I think that's probably because they self-perform more and maybe have a different kind of internal economic structure. The sort of thing that's definitely worth looking into, though, if you're selling to that market, understanding that those economics are that different you're going to want to understand why when you're trying to sell in there, whether it's because they may not have as much interest in labor saving because the labor costs are per capita lower, or the other way around, that some of what they do is more easily automatable. So I think this is an interesting, if you're looking at the EPC and industrial market, I think this is an interesting bullet point that merits further investigation about why that might be true. And again, it may not always be true. It may be more true with chemical plants than it is with, I don't know, small power generation or things like that. So heavy civil is exactly what it sounds like. So you can break that out into utility systems, land subdivision, highway, street and bridge, which is what a lot of us think of as heavy civil, and then other, which is happily not a huge part of it. So utility systems are the biggest piece. In today's world, I was in Texas when everything froze, so I strongly encourage that they keep spending. And then highway, street and bridge, not surprising who's the largest. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what land subdivision is, except for what presumably that is earthworks and so on and so forth. And then in terms of number of firms, lots of utilities, obviously some of that is because they're local monopolies, which supports a bigger number of market. Highway, street and bridge is kind of the opposite, where it really implies you want scale. And that shows up here that you're talking massive capital just in terms of the materials that are being used. So it pays to be larger. And not surprising, utility firms are often large too. Again, these are millions. So 14 million is the average, keeping in mind that that's hiding a lot of smaller firms that are lumped in there. So a little less insight here in that utilities are the biggest number, and for reasons I think monopoly being one of them, and the other obviously being most utilities cannot be delivered over a long distance, so it makes sense to be somewhat local. Highway and classic civil are larger firms on average, again, not surprising. But now you know. So specialty contractors, because we talk about the trades so much, we're going to spend just a little bit more time on that and divide even a layer below this, because these are barely recognizable. I work at CSI, and I can tell you it's funny that this looks like uniformat in terms of what the sections are. That is me geeking out on standards. So when you look at these, foundation, structure, and building is sort of like what it sounds like. It's the kind of outside of the building and the structure of it. Building equipment is basically MEP. Building finishing is what it sounds like, and then other specialty trades. There's dozens of other things that get done in a building, and that gets reflected here. So you look at that, and putting the building up is actually, sorry, this doesn't have tags here, but is actually not the largest piece, which I guess isn't surprising given the value of what goes into a building. But this is more than double. So what the building inside, the building kind of machinery, is double what it costs to build the actual structure, which is really interesting, and more than almost 3 times what it takes to do the finishing, which is framing and so on and so forth. And other specialty trades, there's not a lot to say there. Also interesting is that the money that goes into it is the largest. Not surprising, given that a chiller costs more than a steel beam. Specialty firm, so here's interesting too, is the MEP firms tend to be meaningfully larger than anyone else. It's not surprising maybe though that these aren't far behind. And glaziers, actually glaziers are in here. I don't know enough about what this includes to speak to it, except that these are obviously some large companies as well. There's a lot fewer of them though. And then revenue per worker, I think some of why the other likely includes rarer trades that are smaller and can probably command more per worker, because it's also quite regional, right? You can't fly somebody back and forth to do something, whether it's iron work or something like that. Again, MEP and interior trades, largest block. MEP, marginally larger companies. So what was interesting is the revenue per worker is pretty close. I think that has something to do with everyone being paid by the same GC. So now we're going to go deeper into subcontractors, because I knew you wanted to. So if you remember, there were 4 here. There was foundation, there was equipment, and there was finishing, and then other. So we're going to go into what those look like, because a lot of people are either talking about selling to some of these subs, or at least interested in exploring subcontractors generally. And you could argue pretty convincingly that an EPC manager is closer to a general contractor manager than a foreman at a concrete versus a foreman at framing versus. So point I'm making is, by definition almost, the subtrades are going to be very different from each other. So understanding how they look is going to be really important for people that are interested in this market. So here you're looking at the number of each of these. So there's about, and these are the actual numbers, there's about 50 million people that are in, revenue, 52 billion, in terms of the revenue for concrete and structure. So we saw something like that earlier, but now we're breaking all of it out. So you're seeing that concrete and the structure and roofing are the 2 big chunks of cash. I mean, there's a lot of money in here, but these are 2 kind of standouts. Same thing here in terms of the number of firms. So there's 20,000 doing concrete. Again, you can imagine these are not companies that get to travel very much, because everything they do is big. Masonry, I was surprised by how many there are, to be honest. And it's actually the 3rd largest in terms of money. Again, every building needs this all over the place. So once I hear it, it's not that surprising. And the final piece is kind of revenue per firm. So for all the fact that the concrete structure has the largest amount of money, it's actually, overall revenue, it's interesting that steel and precast concrete are the largest firms. Again, there's going to be equipment reasons for this, scale reasons for this, but I didn't know that. And I'm not sure I knew why that should be true instead of concrete and structure, but that's what the data is showing us. Really interesting. So the most revenue is in structural and roofing. I kind of talked about that. So interesting who winds up being the largest firms. The next one that we hear the most about is building equipment. And if you'll note, it's plumbing, mechanical, and electrical, so MEP, with a little, a meaningful number, but still, about 10%, a little bit less than about 7% is other things. So, the fact that plumbing and mechanical are put together, now they often are, in terms of union behavior and some other things, but nevertheless, I think it skews this a little bit. But electrical contract, excuse me. Folks, whoever did that, please don't do that again. Right. So as I was saying, really interesting how the two are so close to each other. And then again, building equipment, revenue per firm, it's kind of the other. It's interesting that these are, whoever this is tends to be large. There aren't many of them. So presumably this is people doing bigger pieces of the construction job. And again, it's almost, it's really interesting how they're basically identical in terms of revenue per worker. Obviously, they have very similar business models and you know, get paid by the same people to do the same kind of project. So maybe it isn't quite so surprising. So electrical and mechanical plumbing, very similar. Again, other outperforms. I have an idea that this might be about data centers, data installations, and so on. Obviously, that's not collected by the CDC. What am I talking about? CDC, by the census or the BLS. But anyway, that's an idea about why that might be true. So the final one among specialty contractors is finishing. So here's drywall and framing and painting and so on and so forth. Drywall being the largest, finishing carpentry being the second in both cases. Not surprising, that's what the walls are made of. You know, revenue per firm, these are larger. Drywall is larger. Probably, again, they've got inventory to deal with. Interestingly, that the revenue per worker for flooring was the highest. Potentially, maybe that's a skill thing. Maybe that's a union thing. I don't actually know. But in terms of number, it's kind of at the low middle. So as we think about what's out there, when we talk about subcontractors, we now have an idea of some of what's going on out there. Who's a little larger, who's a little smaller, who has more room to pay their workers, and as a result, either invest in those workers or automate what those workers are doing. Again, it's interesting that flooring is where it is. There's a company called Spec Intel that does something really interesting with flooring, and I tell you, it's a lot more complicated than I thought it was. In the past, I wanted to bring this back up again. This just shows you a little of what we saw before and why some of those numbers can be skewed the way they are. This is the same pattern we see across construction generally. It's just, you know, the numbers are a little bit lower for specialty contractors. So this is the number of workers that work for a company with under 5 people, under 10, or between 5 and 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 10, so on and so forth. So you can see it's massively skewed with 1 or 2 person operations that are, you know, a couple of skilled people and the equipment they need. That's an issue across construction. It's both great that people get to do that and get to explore their passion and what they want to do, but it also means that things like technology will have a little bit of difficulty depending on what you're trying to do. And then, you know, the other piece here, again, this shouldn't be surprising, but the larger the company, the more people get paid. That's just kind of a general rule unless you're the proprietor yourself. So what all this means is, I think I mentioned earlier, this analysis will be made available on SlideShare. It's a complicated industry with varying revenue levels, widely varying ability for trades and companies to pay for technology. This is the beginning of a map. I think as people are looking at their own business plans and their own ideas, this gives you an idea of where you might go and questions you might ask. So as I say, a more sophisticated map. So that is the end of that section. If there are any questions, hop in. Now we're going to move a little bit quicker. That's the end of the eye charts, more or less. So we are going to talk more over the coming quarters about real estate and how it relates to construction, whether it's the facilities management side or whether it's commercial real estate. What's interesting over the next slides, I'm going to start to show you how it's such a big market that is so financially driven. There's a lot of ways people slice it. So this is IBIS World. Their suggestion was commercial real estate in the US was $1 trillion. That seems light to me. Every other number I've seen is bigger than that. The growth is fine, 3.8%. I mean, that's, you know, faster than the economy is growing, barely, but interesting that it looks like it shrunk from 2016 to 2021. I think that 2020 probably had something to do with that.
Thank girl. Thank you.
Excuse me?
Oh no.
Thank you. Sorry, guys, I don't put controls on this. I probably should. If you could just keep yourself muted, please. Right, so continuing on, this is another view from REIT.com, where they look at a much bigger number, where they're saying that the number is closer to 16 trillion. So they're saying a high estimate, low estimate. If this looks like financiers doing it, it absolutely is. But it gives you an idea of what's out there in terms of square footage, in terms of total value. So just office, they're thinking is 2.5 trillion. Multifamily, they think is 2.9 trillion. It'd be interesting to see how that moves over time. This is also a couple of years old, so the world has moved on a little bit. But it gives you an idea of what we think of when we talk about all the places that real estate, all the ways that real estate looks at itself, and the numbers that get thrown around. Another one I found interesting, and this is, again, another way of looking at the markets that we sell into or that we support the selling into, is professionally managed real estate. So the size of the professionally managed global real estate investment market. So this is investing in companies, so REITs and so on. They think it's was about 10 trillion last year. Interesting how 10 trillion as a number comes up a lot. People often say that that's the size of the global construction market. The best number I've heard, for what it's worth, is 12. But so what does all that mean? So real estate in its various forms is the ultimate consumer of construction. So it's important for us to understand that. It's huge, it's complex, it's difficult to summarize cleanly. Some markets are more opaque than others. Sometimes the government requires you to report things, and sometimes it doesn't. But by understanding the buyers and users of construction, we can better predict what processes and technologies might find. Now, this last point is important. I have no data on this. I've just heard anecdotally, it isn't obvious that real estate decision makers are more tech adoptive than construction. We give ourselves grief a lot in construction about how it's slow to adopt technology and so on. There's no reason why it isn't as obvious why the purchasing and development part of real estate should be particularly sophisticated when it comes to certain types of technology. Some of them are using, there's a really great group that I'm blanking on the name of, that are using machine learning to help predict markets and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, you're often talking about big assets that are meant to be more or less annuities. So there's definitely a bunch of real estate companies and developers who have no interest in pushing technology forward. They go to a bank, they borrow money, they build something, and it pays them money in a predictable way. So that group has a challenge just like we do. So that's it for the demand side. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I mentioned at the top of the hour. IT teams are getting sophisticated. Last quarter, I talked about this kind of a lot. And my point then was a little more about cybersecurity, and generally was saying that people that sell into this market or are in this market need to understand that the IT quote unquote revolution is rolling through construction. These things don't happen quickly. People have to get hired, they have to get trained, you have to spend some money. Nevertheless, you're hearing some amazing things from some companies, and then you're seeing other very large GCs that aren't moving at all. So I don't want to say that, get FOMO out there that people are worried about catching up. It is more the opportunity to be ahead of the market and reap some of the benefits that a robust IT team can provide. And by extension, data and all the other things that we talk about. So I'll say out loud, it was McCarthy. They presented their data lake, data warehousing strategy, and it was awesome. And it's a waypoint on their journey. They haven't arrived anywhere. But I was really impressed by how they think about data, both in terms of how they manage it, how they onboard, and how they're working to capture their own data, the job site data, operating data, and do things with it. Some of that's going to be a little secret, but they were pretty open about how they've invested in the ability to do these things. The things themselves are where the magic happens. The other thing that's important for those of us who are selling into general contractors or advising and talking to general contractors is the way GCs are able to interact with application data is going to grow more and more integrated. So in a moment, we'll talk about what data lakes and data warehousing is, but the point is that capability means that you're now able to onboard and ingest data from your partners. I talked last time about machine vision and how it's producing just orders of magnitude more data than used to be true. Well, I know that there will be behavior change and process change over time. That it always takes longer. It's almost a cliche that tech is first and culture is second and behavior is last. I think I got that right, but certainly behavior isn't first. I think that this is one of the ways, though, that you're going to start to see contractors, and I'm saying GCs, I shouldn't say that. It really is contractors generally, because some of the mechanical contractors and others and electrical contractors are doing some pretty great things. But the point is, you're going to start to have partnerships that are more interesting than just here's our service. Here's, you log in and use what we do. And what's interesting about that is a couple things. One is it provides new revenue opportunities. This isn't on the doorstep. These are opportunities down the road. You can imagine if you have an enterprise license, both either way, if you're a GC and you have an enterprise license, or if you're a software provider and you have an enterprise license, a way to continue to grow that relationship is to think about data sharing and co-development of data products. And I'll define what I mean by data product in just a minute. But first, I want to make sure that you know, when we use the word data lake, it sort of implies a body of water sitting there doing nothing. And there's a reason they chose that. The first thing to think about is it's scalable. What that means is it's probably almost definitely on a cloud platform like AWS or Azure. And it's built so that if you dump more in there, it'll be okay. It'll be able to handle it. It's purposely large volumes of data because you're dumping things in there you don't know what to do with yet. In its native format is an important point here, is you don't have to transform anything. If you're getting a JSON, you do probably want to tag it so you can find it again, but you don't have to transform it into whatever your storage is. So if you've got videos, you can throw videos down. If you've got tables, if you've got whatever. The point is the data lake is a place where you can keep things and know where they are. It doesn't have to tie to one source. Again, this is definitional. This is what makes it a data lake. But you're pulling things in from different places. Obviously, someone has to connect that. You need a developer or an architect, a software architect to hook things up. But once they are, it doesn't matter if it's structured, if it's semi-structured, or even unstructured. And again, because I hate undefined terms, in 2 slides, I'm going to tell you, or 3 slides, I'm going to tell you what those terms mean too. Data is stored, and this is an important one, in a flat architecture. And that means it's just a bucket that nothing leads to. So what I just showed you actually with construction as a term being at the top, and then you kind of filter down, that was not a flat architecture. You had kind of a nested architecture where things nest under each other in terms of data. In this case, you're saying everything is equal. You just search it and you find it. If you've ever heard the term NoSQL, this is often what they mean, and you'll hear about SQL in just a minute. Lakes are for work in process. They're for data not ready for a process. They're for things that you've grabbed from some process or from your website. Or in fact, I think they started with web traffic, but I'm not sure about that. But the point of a data lake is it allows you to have another thing, which is your data warehouse. Why should you care? So as you get ready for integrations that pull your data and store it internally, if you're a software company, it's probably going to go in a data lake. And get ready to think through your IP ownership. Sorry, this actually is referencing some earlier points. So let me bring you back to when I was talking about openness, but get ready to think through IP ownership of data that you create on contractors' jobs if you're a software company. But the same thing is true. Get ready to think through IP ownership of data you create on owners' jobs as well. So what is going to need to be worked out? And I think there is contract language for it. It's just, people aren't aware of this. But you're now, whoever you are, you're now generating valuable data, and it's worth thinking about that. Understand what IP ownership is, because we don't normally do that. A good question there is, who owns a model if the customer's data was part of training it? So whoever is unmuted, can you mute yourself, please? Right. So now switching gears to data warehouses. I just discovered the mute all button. Look at that. Data warehouses are almost the opposite of a data lake, in that a data lake, the reason I was thinking about IP there, again, is because this is where you're pulling in things that are what, you know, they could have come out of a bit of software, they could have come out of the field, so on and so forth. You're going to want to think about who owns that stuff. It's a little bit easier when you think about a warehouse, because this is about process and transformation of data. Forgive me, folks. Process and transform data for advanced querying. So here you're doing stuff with your data. This is what we think of as a database. Often in this case, it may be connected to multiple applications though, in a more structured database environment. So there, you know, data lakes are often complementary to data warehouses. Warehouses are for, you know, kind of ongoing processes, process data, and so on. Just one second. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. So why should you care about that? Well, investments in data hygiene by GCs are going to mean that some have data that can become part of products that vendors create. So as GCs are, and I say this with confidence because we've seen this happen in other industries where the increasingly IT teams, ops teams, and so on get better and better at data, both the data they produce, the data they consume, and the data they combine, because that's kind of the point here is the value often is when you're pulling things together and creating new correlations and new models and so on. So translating between data models, it's not only going to be from vendor system to vendor system, which you hear people, you know, getting grumpy about that a lot, right? That one system doesn't talk to another, but now it's going to have to include customer systems because they're going to start settling on their own. They are already starting to settle on their own data models and their own way of passing data back and forth. The good thing is this stuff, it's not going to be that cryptic and hard to figure out, but it's going to need work. There are companies out there that provide data, common data environments, and thinking of Rivet and Project Ready, that are good at this. Right now, they're a little focused on things like Sage and Procore and so on. But I think that skill set is going to become, some of it will be internalized. That's what IT teams often do outside of construction. And some of it, I think, is going to be people that have a core of tech and a layer of service on top, like, as I say, Project Ready and Rivet. And there's others. That's who I'm thinking of right now. So I mentioned a moment ago, structured data and unstructured data. Structured data it's data that adheres to a predefined data model. So the reason I'm telling you this now is a second ago, I was just telling you about how these data models are going to need to be a little bit of a translation. And that's when you're talking about structured data. So it adheres to a predefined data model, usually a table, but not only. And as a result, it's easy to analyze. This is important because what you hear people talk about unstructured data, it's because their systems can't do anything with it until it gets transformed. Usually structured data is what a warehouse is. As I say, often tabular form, usually tabular format. Rows and columns is a good way of thinking of it. The relationship between the different rows and columns is part of the point of the data model. You know, in your mind, you can think of an Excel file, and SQL databases are just powerful versions of linked Excel file. I mean, it's more to it than that, but that's a good analogy. And by the way, you can see in the lower right, other than the fine artwork that was contributed to our discussion, the document that I make public has this. You can go click on and look at some of this. I obviously, you know, reference some pretty smart people here. Unstructured data is kind of information in the wild. It's either doesn't have a data model or it isn't really organized in any way. You know, this is what you talk about when people are speaking. That's the definition of unstructured data, or when they're typing, or, you know, someone's writing in a daily report, or so on and so forth. And that's what often we're using AI, often as an API, often as a service from a cloud provider, to turn that unstructured data into something that a computer and more importantly, a narrowly written software can do something with. So a lot of what the difference between a data lake and a data warehouse is a process that takes this unstructured data and makes it into something structured. What's interesting also about structured data, one other point there, is you can have the same data get worked on and restructured repeatedly. Just because it's structured doesn't mean you're done. It just means that you've got it in a way that it's machine readable. Now, the other interesting one here, when you hear about NoSQL databases, they often mean this, and that's semi-structured data. So they're often, it's not in a data model per se, but it's been tagged. So everybody on this, well, most people on this call have probably heard about data getting tagged and so on. Whether it's that or another marker, to separate it into different semantic elements. And by that, they mean that, different types of meaning, different categories, so on and so forth. And the idea of hierarchies don't necessarily need to be in a table in this case. It can be based on the tags. The value of this is you're able to search and kind of organize the data depending on what you need it for. Whereas highly structured data often doesn't make that so easy. So, JSON is what, for those of you who actually, it's really JSON, which I always get wrong, but JSON sounds so like 70s. But that is how data gets passed back and forth, and that's an example of it. So why should you care? I hear this all the time. 95% of data in construction isn't used, but that's because it's unstructured or it's incorrectly structured. I think there's an enormous opportunity in managing the structuring and integrating of data. This is what you hear all the time. I mean, this is what Procore has done a great job of, and an army of other companies. A great example of that is Smart Barrel is taking the kind of login data, or listen to me, the check-in process, and turning that into this kind of key to a bunch of other data that used to be unstructured, but now is. I'm dropping names because I want to get better and better at that, by the way. So don't get embarrassed. Nobody's giving me any money. So there's enormous opportunity in this. The reality is a lot of that's going to be internal to GCs, excuse me, GCs. But I think there's a huge opportunity to go beyond just app marketplaces to start to think about how data can be passed back and forth. And trust me, people are doing this, they're thinking of it. But I think it's deep in the bowels of a Procore and an Autodesk. But for companies that are smaller and potentially more nimble in their data strategies, this is a great opportunity. So when I say data product, I mean, the word kind of tells you what I mean, but I wanted to define it because that's what we like to do. What do you call it? So increasingly, as I say, data sets are used in combination. This has been used in the credit card industry and the direct mail industry for literally decades, where you take different data sets and combine them for new things. Data products can be anything from a dashboard to an AI model to a customer feedback loop to targeting strategies, so on and so forth. I think you're going to find this in models a lot as we combine different data sets to be able to understand and predict what's going on the job site. They can also include syndicated data sets. So one of the things that happens with data a lot is, as cool as it is to have your data set, providing your data set to someone else will very often mean that it doesn't quite do for them what you wish it did. So what winds up happening is you're able to give them background. You're able to you're able to give them the starting data that they can then append their data. So in other words, you as open space might provide a bunch of data as a product to a company, or a GC or another company that can then combine that with other things like supply chain or weather or whatever. And all of a sudden you've got a new data product. So you're going to hear this more and more as data becomes more and more connected and open. What does all this mean? We've heard this word digital exhaust a lot. I don't love that word, but it is what it is. I think it's important to start thinking about sorry, we're trying to get rid of something here. I keep doing it wrong. It's important to think about data as things that can be combined to provide value and context. It's important also to think data is evidence that something is happening, and that looked at that way, you can start to ask, well, what could this be combined with to help me understand about what's going on in the world? And then I've said this already, but take some time to get sophisticated about IP licensing. It isn't really that complicated, at least not at the level that most people are going to need to get. But you hear people talk about patents a lot, and honestly, that there's not that there's no value in patents. Understanding IP licensing, I think, is the next area where companies large and small are going to want to get smart and make sure their contracts reflect that. So my last piece, we've got a couple of minutes left. I talked last time about Michael Porter, so I'd like to bring in these ideas from the past. Porter's 5 forces we talked about last time. The key insight of this is that you are, as a company, are not in competition for sales. You are in competition for profit. And the reason that matters is it isn't just people that do stuff like you that you're competing against. It's your suppliers. It's also your buyers. It's also people that could come in and do what you do as a substitute or as a new entrant. So understanding, and then of course there's direct competition we're used to. The reason that's interesting is it opens up the idea of the value chain. So the point of a value chain is the sequence of activities and resources. So we don't talk about resources as much as we might, and it's important to think of here to support them. The resources that support these activities provide value as the customer perceives it. These are the strategic levers firms can pull to create a unique, sustainably differentiated business. So examples of people that have done things like this. Before I get into that, actually, you hear about Michael Dell. This is often, so the value chain and business model are often similar. The difference is value chain is a slightly broader idea because it includes some activities that don't directly relate to cash, whereas a business model frequently does. But what's interesting about Dell, you've heard this example before, but it gives you an idea of value chain, is the process of pulling an order in included getting paid before they had ordered any of their own components. So they reversed a piece of the value chain, and in so doing, earned money at scale that they otherwise might not have, and definitely needed to have a lot less working capital than others. Apple did the same thing where they said, our distribution is we're going to control distribution. Nespresso did the same thing where they said, we're going to control the creation of or the brewing of our coffee. Keurig did a similar thing. The two are quite similar. So the point in this is construction is often, people want construction to be like consumer software in that you create the thing and off it goes. You don't have to service it. I think it's more like medical, where there are definitely great profits to be made, but you need service as a component to some degree until you don't, but there's a long time before you don't. Witness the fact that the sales and after sales service of Procore and everybody are still so large, even though these are public companies that are clearly doing well. So when you think about value chain innovation, how are you getting financed? Is it necessary that the money that you use to grow and so on is from a VC or an angel? In the beginning, it might be, or is it a grant or so on? Are you able to outlast the competition because you're thinking about vendor financing, which is another way of saying, borrow against invoices if you need to. How is your software introduced to people? Can you do so more cheaply? One of the big killers of software is customer acquisition costs. How is your software adopted? In construction, it's becoming more and more widely understood that a pilot doesn't indicate anything other than what a pilot might, which is initial interest. So how is it being adopted? And can you do that more cheaply? Do you need to burn that much time selling it into the company? How is your software used over time? All of these are part of the value chain. So I'm introducing it, I'm getting it adopted, I'm providing value, I'm using it over time. How do you reduce churn? So on and so forth. How is it paid for? So in another area people often look for innovation is changing the way things get paid for. Procore famously did this by kind of ratcheting it to how much revenue the company makes instead of being perceived. You could argue that, well, it's not even an argument. SaaS itself is an utter change in the value chain that, of course, is industry-wide. The final one that you hear me talk about so much is how is it integrated? Are you providing value in combination with people, including the internal customer, or is it just one single transaction or one flow of value? There's another one here that this was supposed to be a build, but whatever. So value curves, there's a book called Blue Ocean Strategy. It had a couple of good ideas in it. And one of them was a way of thinking of competition. This is not that different from the tables where you say, we do this and they do that and we're better and they're worse. But the interesting thing here is it's a creative process. in that you're saying, if you look at tablet PCs and netbooks, which was a thing back then, the browsing speed of the tablets was reasonable. The netbooks wasn't so good. The battery life wasn't so good. The user experience was mediocre. The price, on the other hand, for these was lower, and the features and technology was lower. So iPad came out with saying, we're going to have awesome speed. We're going to have great battery life. We're going to have a great user experience, but it's going to be a little expensive, and it's going to be a little thinly featured compared to others. And it took over. This is an insight that you could argue Apple routinely makes, and that is that people want a great experience that doesn't stop, that is fast. So these three together are all about great experience. And you know what? It may not have to do everything. And you know what? We're going to charge you more for it. This is an interesting way to go. And the reason I bring these two up is because obviously a value chain and value curve can be used together, especially if you're saying to yourself, what in the value chain, now that I understand the competitive world that I'm in, what of these factors, now these are made up for iPad, but what of these factors do I think are going to put me in a better place vis-a-vis the various people trying to steal my money? I'm not sure Porter puts it that way. So folks, we're at the top of the hour. I was remarkably accurate, which doesn't always happen. I'm kind of touting the book. Check my book out if you haven't yet. I've had some incredibly amazing conversations in the podcast. We do that twice a week. Just recently with Matt Abels of ABC, and earlier this week, Ray Levitt of Blackhorn Ventures, both amazing conversations. And I say this every time, that there's a huge community out there. I encourage you to check out. The construction dorks are hysterical. Procore.org is just doing amazing things in DE&I and education and so forth. CSI is who I work with. We've just rebranded. I'm proud of that. But CSI provides a lot on the earlier parts of the job in terms of free information and some training and so on. And then along the side, Society of Construction Solutions, Blue Collar, and the Construction Progress Coalition, as well as the Contact Crew. I'm sorry, I'm reading everything out here. Thank you all for coming. We are at the top of the hour. I have some time for Q&A and welcome any questions. In the meantime, I'm going to try to get rid of that art. I think you can all unmute yourselves now. I hope.
I'll be the first one to check. Can you hear me, Hugh?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Looks like it works. Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful, but I guess one major question I have around particularly the statistics at the beginning. What are your thoughts toward those statistics, just like overarching thoughts on the industry itself, and what causes some of that chasm? I know you talked about on a specific like trade by trade basis, but in general, is there anything that you found during your research that was just mind boggling, or maybe had you thinking?
I wouldn't say anything mind boggling. What I would say, some things were interesting and it wasn't that they were surprising. I just didn't think of it. Looking at trades that obviously benefit from scale, they're bigger. Some of the size of some of the other categories was like, oh, that's interesting. Beyond that, I think the value to me is understanding what's out there, as opposed to it being an undifferentiated mass that you don't know what to do with. That for me was what was really interesting in there. I also think some of the disparities in how much is earned now, that may or may not be a proxy of pay. But I would assume it is, because if you make less with people, you have less to pay them. So some of the disparities within the trades I also found kind of interesting. Yeah, beyond that, I think it's just there's a lot in there. And I think a lot of it opens up questions as opposed to necessarily driving answers. But at the beginning of your question, you asked almost about what do I think about those statistics generally. And it's worth keeping in mind, these are industry-wide, economy-wide, a couple of years old. For me, it's more about what are you learning from this and what questions does it lead, than saying, okay, I can now build a business plan from those specific numbers. I mean, you kind of can, because the reality is by the time you execute, you're going to learn so much more. I had a great conversation with Ronan from Ignite a couple of months ago, where he was like, "Where'd you get those numbers?" Because he had started long ago with numbers, I think, that were at that level of accuracy. But as they executed and as he built out a sale, this is Ronan Vengosh from Ignite. He had gone and bought, real data, like when I say real data, data that somebody went out there, spent money and collected. So I think the value of this is to ask questions and be aware of the kind of complexity of the market, so that when you're ready to go execute, you can increasingly invest in better, more refined pictures and answers, which is what go-to-market is.
How often how often that the Bureau publish? Because you mentioned this is information from 2017.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how the market has changed. I mean, the explosion of technology has just happened in probably the last 4 years, maybe. And then not only that, but when you think about construction, the explosion of like warehouses and data centers that are currently being built and are projected to be built, plus the, the expansion of like all airports, but also hospitals. Like how, do you think we're going to see a big change in the next publish of the Bureau?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe they're supposed to do it every 5 years, which is why I'm pretty sure within the next 18 months we should, but then they release it at the pace they release it. I mean, it's the ultimate bureaucracy. But to answer your question, everything you just described wouldn't move most of these numbers, I don't think. I think that they're not maybe collecting some numbers that might get moved. So you didn't see me talking about purchases of technology or kind of expenditures very much. Where I think you would probably see some differences is the industrial, and I'm assuming that that's well, yeah, maybe not, because I think that what you're talking about, warehousing versus retail, would both fall under commercial. You know what I mean? So I think the interesting thing is whether they start collecting more fine-grained information that reflects some of the changes that you're talking about. I don't get me wrong, it has been 5 years and it's been 5 pretty busy years. So because obviously this data would have been collected even earlier than in 2016, presumably. So I'm really eager for them to come out with this information, and the fact that somebody's going to spend $1 trillion on a lot of these sections, or a lot of these industry sectors, means it's got to be interesting. So I absolutely know what you mean. I can't tell you where I think big changes would be, because it's so focused on sectors as opposed to activities.
I have quick questions. On one of the slides, you said the top 20 GC presented their data lake in their warehouse strategies. So what about the rest of the other GCs and specialty contractors?
Yeah, it's funny. I was trying to be cagey when I wrote the slide, and then I kind of gave it up and said, no, actually it's McCarthy, and those guys because they probably don't mind it, since they said it publicly. I'm referencing something they said publicly. My experience is that and it's limited because not everybody calls me up and tells me what they're doing, but I've talked to a few folks for various reasons. And I think you're seeing some companies view it as a strategy they know how to execute, and others you're hearing them say things like, we're going to be a tech company that does construction or something like that. And that may or may not be currently reflected because they know how to execute versus not. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a comfort level with how to hire and how to really execute that it takes a minute, and it takes a level of prioritization that may or may not line up with what that company is currently doing, if that makes sense. I think sometimes we assume that everybody should be moving forward, as fast as possible, but the reality is they have the mix of projects that they have that may or may not, benefit or from some of these technologies. So the answer is, I think it's really a patchwork. And I'd be honest with you, I think if you look at if you look at the economy generally, it's a patchwork. There are some companies that you'll blow your mind how good they are, and some companies that you cannot imagine how bad they are given what else they do so well. And there's no reason to think construction that won't happen too. Is you'll have some rock stars that make it a strategic priority and then go execute, and others that take longer.
Hey, Hugh. So I had a question about data standards. So in previous iterations of technology and new industries, there's been a lot of competition on both the higher value stuff, but a lot of innovation on the lower level stuff just because it has to get done. You're seeing that with the tool companies now arguing over connections like Bluetooth or otherwise. But I just wanted to find out if you're seeing any movement towards either data standards or interoperability or open sourcing or anything at the lower level, so that we can all focus on the better, bigger value stuff.
Yeah, so Nathan Wood has been doing the CDX, the Construction Data Exchange. I hope that I got that right, for a while, and really pushing and leading discussions around how can we, make data models talk to each other. Realistically, I think that he's adding tons of value. I don't know how much that's going to wind up being what does it. I think in the RFI workflow, that's a big focus of his. I think there's definitely progress being made. I think that modern software is pretty good at allowing you to connect and translate between data models and data formats. I think that's going to wind up being a bigger solution than standards. To be honest with you, I almost never hear open source in construction. I'm sure it's there, but I just don't hear that talked about so much in terms of software and standards and so on. It's such a silo to silo to silo. I mean, even within a company, it's silo to silo to silo in terms of projects. So I think that may be one of the reasons for it. I think we're going to have to figure out bridges as opposed to hoping we can pave the road all the way. I may be wrong, but I think that's going to wind up being what happens. I mean, my day job is an API that connects the CSI standards so that we can, and so I hope that we can use master format and OmniClass to kind of guide data flows, but other people want to do that. Ronan has a great comment. Open APIs are key. Incredible that tech companies out there that haven't signed up for that. Sorry, Ronan, but I think that's right. I think Ronan has a really good point, is that, connecting your API and making it discoverable and making your how you ask for and provide data isn't that hard. And it should be, I mean, it's hard if you've got a big code base, but you know what? It's been out there for so long. Salesforce was doing this almost a decade ago, not quite that much, 7-8 years ago. So it's been out there as a good idea. Procore, I think, did a really good job of really mimicking a lot of what Salesforce did, whether that's explicitly what they did. It certainly looks a lot like. So yeah, I think Ronan's right that you're going to wind up being API networks before you're going to wind up being standards, except maybe in some narrow uses, just because people don't agree.
Okay, thanks.
Would that it were so. Well, guys, I'll hang out for a minute. I really appreciate you all being here. For the person that posted how I can get rid of this artwork, I appreciate it. I was too busy talking to figure it out, but next time we'll lock some of that down.
No problem. Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, thank you all. As I said at the top of this, I'm going to take this recording, put it on YouTube, as well as the slides themselves. Again, sans the extra artwork. And I'll transcribe it as well. I will see about that. It might be a little messier than I want it to be. But either way, available, free for everybody to look at. Grab stuff from the PDFs if it's of value. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.